All right, let's turn overseas now, where today global forces heightened the assault against ISIS. Today, the French launched its first airstrikes against the militant group in Iraq. This as authorities in Australia carried out a massive raid foiling a plot by ISIS early in the week. And the terrorist group, they've posted yet another video of a British journalist, this time being held hostage, John Cantil. He was abducted in Syria 2 years ago. And as you know, this week, the president restated that the U.S. will not be putting boots on the ground. However, Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Martin Dempsey, he said otherwise.
If we reach the point where I believe our advisors should accompany Iraq troops on attacks against specific ISIL targets, I'll recommend that to the president.
I will not commit you and the rest of our armed forces to fighting another ground war in Iraq.
All right, let me bring in Mike Lyons now, a former Army captain who served in Iraq, also a military analyst for CBS News Radio, senior fellow at the Truman National Security Project in D.C. He's good enough to join us. Mike, usually, you know, Joint Chiefs and the President singing the same song here, and nobody thinks Mr. Dempsey is new to this. You go before the Senate Armed Services Committee and you say something different than the Commander-in-Chief. What's going on?
He got asked a hypothetical. I think that was the first issue, and the president did tell him to give him options. As the general officer that's responsible for the military, he has that responsibility. So I think that was part of it. Now, the military does three things, the Army in particular, right? We train other armies and soldiers. We work alongside them and give them ministerial support. We work with maps and we kind of do oversight. And then the third thing is we're aligned with them in combat, right? So we're doing the first two in Iraq. What the president's saying, we're never going to do the third in Iraq. So it's a little bit of maybe splitting hairs in that regard, but what the president is really saying, we're not going to deploy tens, 20,000 divisions, armor tanks, all those kinds of things into Iraq to help this fight.
But it's interesting. I'm not just talking armchair journalists. I'm talking journalists who served for the president. In fact, if we could bring up the graphic, and this one from retired Marine General James Mattis, who talking about what we should or shouldn't do here, he was pretty clear that maybe airstrikes aren't going to be enough. He said, half-hearted or tentative efforts or airstrikes alone can backfire on us and actually strengthen our foes' credibility. We may not wish to reassure our enemies in advance that they will not see American boots on the ground. And even the New York Times, you pick it up today, and what are the two above the fold, the two front page things are, Syria, the rebels ain't ready here, right? Mm-hmm. We can give them all the weapons we want here, but they can't win, and at least as currently constituted. And secondarily, ISIS, they control Iraqi cities, and yeah, airstrikes can help in certain places, but you're not going to re-rat them out of communities that they've taken over completely. If we really deem them to be an international threat or a threat to national security, however you want to frame it, airstrikes alone won't cut it. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, General Mattis in particular, nicknamed Mad Dog, I mean, he's basically saying that we've got to, someone is going to have to go in on the ground. We won't be able to just bomb them from the air, and most military people, every military expert will tell you that from the beginning. So what he's also saying is we take options off the table, you know, and we shouldn't maybe telegraph that. Sometimes less is better. But in this particular administration, they want to not be like Bush. They want to not be like what happened in the past. You know, we've got this analogy now. We're going to compare boots on the ground, troops on the ground now to the war in Iraq, where we used to do that to Vietnam. So we've come, you know, 30 years after the fact, and now that's going to be the end all of how we ever put troops in locations, because what we did in Iraq. Before that, it was Vietnam, and I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of what's happened.
But don't we almost have to decide, though, Mike, what we're trying to accomplish with ISIS? I mean, listen, let's be honest. The two beheading videos, right? And then the headline coming out of Australia when they do a midnight raid because they were going to do beheadings in broad daylight, or at least that was the plot. Now they're elevated, and then the question becomes, okay, if we've established, and the president has said, not only are they really bad guys, but they're security threats, then do we have to define what we're trying to accomplish before we say what we will and won't do?
Yeah, I mean, our enemy just can't be terrorism. We've got to, if we're going to go to war, and that's what, you know, that's the language the military wants to hear, because that implies commitment from the country, not just the military. It's got to be against a known entity that is somewhat conventional. Now, again, this is going to be an asymmetrical fight for whoever's going to be doing it on the ground.
Explain what that means.
So, in a conventional war, there are clear boundaries, and the other side has a clear uniform, and you can tell who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And we've been fighting non-conventional warfare in the Middle East, really since we've been inside of Iraq. And it's likely that will be part of this process going forward. That's not to say, though, that the Iraqi security forces can get inside those towns and villages where ISIS is. It's much more difficult for a foreign military to come in and try to fight a non-conventional war because we're playing an away game, so to speak. And so that's what the president's saying we're not going to do. So, and that's why it's important that these ground forces stay inside of Iraq and fight it there. Now, let's face it, there's also, Syria and Iraq are two different lanes. They're almost two different missions, and I think the focus clearly right now is Iraq. Retaking that border. The town of Mosul, for example, 1 million people in Mosul, significant security concerns there. If we can't get those northern towns to tip back on the favor of the Iraqi government, ISIS is going to rule there for a very long time.
My question, though, is we've gone down this path. We got 1,600 troops on the ground. They haven't gone out with the missions, but they will at some point in order to do this. The military is saying, look, you're tying my hands behind my back. The mission that you've stated for the political purposes for the public cannot be accomplished alone. And I think my question is, I mean, they've got to be terribly frustrated. The first infantryman that's out there in a combat advisory role and who's taken by the enemy will have us in battle.
Yeah. Or the pilot that's shot down that we can't rescue. I mean,
how do you deal with that?
They're in harm's way, and that's where the president, hasn't necessarily explained that very well, because he is so focused on the 30,000, 40,000 troop levels in terms of how the war is going. So,
well, if the assumption is that you're never going to be able to get rid of the threat, because it's not a nation-state threat, it's a moving target the entire time, and even if you bomb them where they are now, another group will rise from its place, then does that change, or should that change what the mission is? So instead of total destruction of ISIL, which would probably require ground troops, maybe it can be done from airstrikes alone, because it's just about destabilizing them or degrading them.
And then that will. The airstrikes blunt any offenses they make, and they keep them from advancing. But what I really believe the policy will be is containment, which has been the foreign policy for most of our enemies for the past 40 years since the end of the Cold War. So basically push them out of Iraq, reestablish our ally in Iraq, reestablish that border, put them into Syria. Now they're inside of Syria. You've got Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front, you've got the Koshians, you have all kinds of terrorist groups. They're all going to fight each other,
and a government there we don't like too.
Right. So we're gonna contain that and watch it and see what happens, and then go from there.
But can I just follow up with a question? Because those same Nusra and the Al Qaeda are in the same areas where the moderate rebels are fighting. They're sharing the weapons. They're fighting both the regime as well as ISIS. How do we as an American military group actually arm them and not essentially put ourselves at risk?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing where the risk is low is because there's really not that many of them. I mean, when you think about it, training 5,000 Syrian Free Army rebels, you're going to take them off the battlefield for 6 months. You're going to put them back up against an ISIS force, which by that point could be 40,000 troops. So the numbers don't work there. I know that Secretary Hagel tried to explain that in his testimony, and he wasn't able to explain it very well. So from the military's perspective, that's not going to be that bad. Sure, that's a definite possibility that those weapons could come back on American soldiers.
They're going to wrap me and say, I want to ask something. I saw this in an editorial, if I could bring up what George Friedman had to say, and his point was, yeah, ISIS is a threat here, but there's a lot of other moving parts that are going into it. And again, this was his point. Is ISIS really a problem for the U.S.? Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they got more skin in the game in here than the U.S. does. So long as they believe that the U.S. will attempt to control the situation, it's a perfectly rational for them to back off and watch, or even act in the margins, even hindering the Americans. Is he right that, again, you got so many different actors with so many different agendas in the Middle East? Let's face it, who's funneling ISIS the money, for crying out loud? And who's giving them pathways to cause all this trouble? don't we almost, it seems to me that we're fighting so many fights at the same time, but we don't even know who our allies are versus who are our enemies sometimes.
One nation that's given ISIS money is the French, who now have started bombing them after announcing it 24 hours ago. And they seem to couldn't wait to get the news out that they had taken out a logistics depot that I'd like to understand why we didn't take out. That thing was going nowhere. Those things are there for a long time. But you're right, that's a great example.
French are probably selling more ammunition tomorrow.
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly. So I mean, I remember being in the Middle East during combat. We picked up weapons and ammunition from Jordan, from all other allies of ours. So there's no telling. The awash of weapons systems in that part of the world is crazy.
But can I ask you this question? It's mind-boggling. Okay, we're focused on ISIL or ISIS. And the Wall Street Journal had a great article today. It talked about the Al-Qaeda working in Syria that is perhaps more dangerous to America than ISIS is, which is primarily trying to take territory.
Right, and that's the thing, because they're focused on aviation assets, they're focused on actually planning missions to attack America. They don't necessarily have to take land. Now, where Al-Qaeda will lose if they don't get the talent that ISIS is getting. I mean, this is a war of talent that's taking place. It's almost a bizarro world opposite of what we would perceive to be, you know, how the real world would work. But that's what's happening. They're losing talent. Bomb makers, for example, they're aligning more with ISIS, and they're losing that kind of talent. But that's correct. They're more focused on attacking America.
I think you said bizarro world here. We're talking the talent, the bomb makers. All right, Mike, stick around here. When we come back, closer to home, a world-renowned forensic expert released his findings after reviewing the results of the Eric Garner autopsy. Of course, that's the Staten Island case here. We're going to have a look at those findings after the break and talk about what happens next in the case.